you. I've been here all of 30 hours, and already I want to move here. But I just want to say thank you all for coming, and I look forward to the Q&A afterwards. But just as like a little introduction, this movie was made, I started shooting it in 1980, and it took about a year and a half to complete, and so it came out in 1982. And I think, I hope you'll find it an interesting portrait of New York at a certain time, and a New York that actually no longer exists. But anyway, I thank you all for coming here, and I look forward to answering your questions afterwards. Thanks.
Susan, thank you so much for being here and showing this movie. How did all this kind of come about?
Yeah, this came about. I'd gone to NYU Film School in the mid to late 70s, and I'd started making short films, and then the films were getting a little longer and a little longer, and I stayed friendly with the people that I had met in film school, and I decided, well, why don't we just try to make a feature-length film? Very naively, because I didn't know how complicated it would be to make that film. So we actually started out in 1980 with about $20,000 and thought we could make a feature for that amount.
That was a huge amount of money in 1980, right?
It was
no,
a
not
huge
quite.
amount of money. You know what happened? I mean, honestly, what happened was my grandmother passed away, and she had left me money for my future wedding.
Okay.
And I decided to put it to another use. So we started to make this movie, and basically what happened, I didn't know how I was going to finish it. I didn't know, I didn't think about, I didn't know much about film festivals or distribution, but we started to make it in about 2 weeks into the filming. The lead actress, Susan Berman, had an accident. We were doing a rehearsal. She broke her leg. And the production came to a halt. And I thought, oh, God, this is horrible, because I really didn't know how I would keep everyone together, because no one was getting paid. We were all doing it kind of as a labor of love. And but what happened was it gave me a kind of hiatus to be able to look at the dailies, see what we had, see what was working and what wasn't working. And what we did at that point was we actually recast the lead role. Richard Hell wasn't originally cast in that role of Eric. It was a French actor, actually, and he wasn't a rocker, he was a painter. But it wasn't, the chemistry wasn't quite there. So I edited the scenes that were working, recast the movie, and then after 3 months of this, when her leg got out of the cast, continued.
Everybody always says that everyone fell in love with Richard Hell. In Legs McNeil's book, he was like, everybody was in love with Richard Hell. Was that true?
Some people fell in love with Richard Hell. No, he's very charismatic, and he's great at, I mean, he wasn't an actor, but he had just this great look and attitude and authenticity, which is what we were going for. And I think that, had I continued with the original actor, it wouldn't have been the same movie.
Sure. It's so important,
yeah,
that chemistry. So I want to take some questions from the audience in just a minute, but first I want to, when you watch this movie now, it feels like it's so imbued with its time and place. Was that, do you think about that when you make a movie? Like, how do we make this feel so much of its time?
It's interesting, because when I was watching it, I was actually surprised at how some of the fashions have come back around.
Sure, yeah.
Which was really weird. I mean, it's a 40-year-old movie. But again, it is a little time capsule of that time, and so much of New York has changed. For example, where we were filming, where the van is now actually Trump Towers. Not the Fifth Avenue one, but Trump City or whatever it's called. All of Second Avenue has changed. So for me, just as a little documentary portrait of New York of a, at that time is fascinating to watch.
And was it intentional? Were you sort of realizing that, like, oh, all this stuff's this is a really important time. Let's kind of make it feel shot through with this time and place.
No.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But what I do like is I'm kind of an observer, and I think that's what film directors are. We kind of watch the world around us. So I think having been there at that time and almost like a cultural anthropologist, I was interested in trying to capture the energy of that. And the music and the sound and the
yeah,
feel.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it really feels like you're in a time machine, and it's a
Yeah.
time machine that I would love to just stay in, or just keep going back. Who in our audience here has a question or a comment or anything? Right over here, yeah.
I love music in the film so much, and as someone from New Jersey, I want to ask, what made you choose the best New Jersey band of all time, the Feelies?
Yeah, we talked about this over dinner. What maybe Jonathan Demme. I had never made a movie before. Somebody, I knew who Jonathan Demme was, and somebody put me in touch with him, and he was very supportive of up-and-coming directors. He was just a very generous person, and he gave me a list of some musicians that I might want to meet with. The Feelies were the second person on the second group on the list. The first person was John Cale. So this almost would have been a John Cale soundtrack, but I'm glad it was the Feelies.
Oh yeah, it really.
And one thing about the Feelies, this music was edited for the movie to kind of fit. I re-edited the scenes to kind of fit the energy of their music. But, this character is a very impatient person. And what I like about her is her just kind of drive and tenacity. And she just, like a bulldog, she just keeps going forward. And that music had that energy in it.
Totally.
And so that's why I was, when I heard it, I just thought, this is Ren.
Yeah, it's just perfect. Right over here.
Yeah, as someone who lived on the Lower East Side at that time, great film. This and maybe Wild Style capture that time and that place. You were crazy young when you made that movie, and I don't see, what were your creative and cinematic influences going into that? What were you emulating?
I really, I had no money, and I also, $20,000 to make a feature, although some people were doing it, making features back then for $5,000. But I believe that I wanted to make the cheapness, my budget, part of the aesthetic. And so I was very inspired by a lot of the French New Wave cinema, like Godard's movies that just sort of use the streets, and if somebody was looking in the camera, so be it. But just to use the kind of energy and the scrappiness as part of the aesthetic. And the other thing I was inspired by the way, in terms of the main character, was I really liked Fellini's early movies. So I really love kind of feisty female protagonists. So Giulietta Messina in Nights of Cabiria was very much an inspiration for this character. In fact, if you haven't seen the movie, it's a great movie. But she wears this little shaggy jacket throughout a lot of the movie. That was the inspiration for that. Kind of looks like a bath mat. But that was very much a kind of homage to her. Yeah.
I'm very proud of this audience because I know that practically everyone here has seen Nights of Cabiria, so that's pretty cool. I saw your hand first, right back here. We should note that you made a movie called Desperately Seeking Susan after this one. Yes,
Yeah.
people who don't know.
Madonna is like a more successful version of this character. So this is sort of the grittier side of that kind of character. But again, I loved being in New York at that particular time, and I love the kind of vibrancy and the seediness, quite frankly. Because there was a kind of outlaw feeling a little bit, even more so at this time period. This was 80, so Desperately Seeking Susan was 4 years later. The city was a little more gentrified, and you can see that if you watch Desperately Seeking Susan. It's a little more magical or glamorized version of this. But again, just the texture of downtown at that time was really compelling to me as a visual.
Yeah, this was closer to. I mean, this was after that, but this was closer to the Ford to New York, Drop Dead, and the Bronx is Burning era, and Summer
Yeah.
of Sam, and all
Yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah. I see. Oh, I saw your hand first. Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned that you recast the lead actor, and my question was, how did you end up going about getting Richard Hell as that character in that film?
I knew who he was. I mean, I lived in the in the Lower East Side, and so I knew of his band, and I knew of television before the Voidoids. So I was again, and so I started to meet with some people who were in bands at that time. Another person I met with for this role that I ended up going with Richard Hell was David Johansen. But again, for me, it was more important to find somebody who had the right persona as opposed to was necessarily an experienced actor, and he had it.
I see. I think I see Dennis back there. I think that's who that is.
Yeah. Yeah, what was great about back then is that the independent film community was pretty small. So everyone kind of, if you didn't know somebody, if you weren't friends with them, you sort of knew a friend of theirs. And I think it was a guy named Amos Poe who had made some films around that time who introduced me to Cookie. And I like B movies, and so it was an opportunity to kind of direct a mini one. Cookie was just around. She was just sort of friends with friends. Yeah.
Is there more of that movie in a can someplace?
Not too much more.
Not too much more. Yeah.
I think the plot was kind of condensed.
Yeah. Sure. So there's not like 70 more minutes of that someplace.
No.
Let's see. I see a hand right over here.
Yeah, so when I watched this movie and other New York kind of punk films of the era, like Jim Jarmusch and Abel Ferrara, there's this kind of like apocalyptic look to the city. And you were just mentioning that it was a small community at the time. So were you and those other like indie New York directors kind of talking about that and talking about your vision of New York? Because it definitely has a comparable way of seeing the city during that time.
I don't think we were talking about it, but we were all living through the same time period. And to me, it was I find it kind of beautiful in its kind of rubble and grittiness. And to me, that texture is ugly and beautiful at the same time. And I think we all kind of felt that. And again, like Jim Jarmusch, he went to NYU Film School with me. So again, it wasn't something that you discussed. It was just something, if you were there at the time, you just could kind of feel it on the streets.
And I think the Film Commission eventually just tried to start steering people away from the rubble and the grime.
Yeah, the city started to also get gentrified. And the other thing that happened, is I was very naive. That's the great thing about making a film when you're young and you don't know better, is I never got permits. I didn't know you needed them. So we just sort of said, oh, this is a cool place. Let's just park the van here and shoot. Or, once everything got a little bit more official, I think that probably certain areas were considered dangerous and off limits.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's great advice to everybody who's an aspiring filmmaker or a filmmaker is permits, schmermits, Right over here.
Um, yeah, colors was really important. Again, because this is a gritty subject matter, and because there's a sadness to the character. I quite like her determination and feistiness, but I'm very aware that she's very self-destructive. I think that color elevated it a little bit by just sort of popping the colors a bit. It took a little bit of it, instead of it being just totally depressing, it sort of made it a little bit, it removed it from reality a little bit because the colors were exaggerated. I mean, for example, the green doorway that she was, we painted that. That wasn't there. We painted it. Eric's loft was the graffiti stuff was painted. The van. Funny story is a guy named Lee Kionis, who became a very famous graffiti artist, who at that time was just hanging around. I think we paid him maybe $50 to paint the van. After the film was finished, I had this painted van, and I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't just keep parking it on the street. So I asked my dad, in suburban Philadelphia, if I could park it in his driveway. I came back a couple weeks later, and it was gone. He had scrapped it or had given it away to somebody.
Aw.
And now, if he had kept it, God knows what it would have been worth.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely. Oh, well.
Yeah.
Live and learn.
Yeah.
I see a hand all the way in the back here.
Oh. Oh, wow. Well, the world has gotten, I'm, being a parent now and older. I think I would have guided, if Ren was my daughter, I would have guided her differently. But I think that, again, she's self-destructive, but her determination, I'd like to think she's clever enough to kind of figure out what to do with their life, at the end of the movie. And I mean, she is a manipulator, but the film is also about manipulation. She's manipulating Eric, she's manipulating Paul. Eric is manipulating her. Paul manipulates the guy who buys his van at the end, the broken van at the end. So I do hope that she's smart enough or a survivor enough to figure out the best next step.
Do you think she would make it to LA ever?
She did.
Yeah? Okay. All right.
I think she would, yeah, I'd like to think she would have, if not LA, whatever the next.
Malibu.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if we have maybe a couple more questions. This is going so well. I'm really appreciating it. Right over here, yeah.
Thanks for taking my question again. So I read on the Wikipedia page that this was actually the first American independent film to be submitted to Cannes, and I just wanted to know how that became.
Yeah. Not submitted. It was accepted in the official selection. There might have been other independent films in some of the other categories, but this was in the official selection. Again, sometimes naivete is really an asset. I didn't know much about film festivals. This was 1982. There weren't books or the internet giving you lists. I literally had heard, the few I had heard of. Yeah, well, the one was Cannes. That was the biggest one. I sent a postcard to, I got an address somehow, I don't remember how, but, where you can send an application. I literally sent a postcard saying, I have a film I'd like to screen for you. And a couple weeks later, somebody just called me and said, the representatives from the Cannes Film Festival are here in New York. bring your film to this address, a screening room in this address, and they'll take a look. And that's what I did, and then was shocked. Yeah.
And how did it go over at Cannes at the screening?
It went. I mean, it was a weird experience because originally I never thought it would be in the official selection. I applied to the Directors Fortnight, which is where first-time filmmakers would submit their film, and it was accepted into the Directors Fortnight, and which was shocking to me. And then about a couple days later, I got a call from the head of the festival, a guy named Jules Jacob at the time, saying, I heard about your film, I'd like to see it, and we are considering taking it out of the Directors Fortnight and moving it into the official selection, which, again, this was totally mind-blowing. But what happened was that I met with this guy, the representative from Cannes, and he said, if we show your film at Cannes, it was shot in 16 millimeter. We can't show a 16 millimeter print. We don't project in 16. It needs to be blown up to 35. I had zero money. I hadn't even paid the final lab bill because I just wasn't thinking ahead. So as he was telling me this, we were having this breakfast conversation in a hotel in Midtown. And he said, you need to blow it up. That's going to cost you $20,000. You need a press person. You need to make posters, publicist, all this stuff. Literally, at the table next to me, there were two people who were having breakfast. And they turned to me and they said, we will lend you the money if you let us be the representatives. It turns out they were film reps. If you let us represent the film at Cannes, we will front you that money. And yeah.
Wow.
Crazy.
It just happened.
Crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I see a hand waving in the back here.
Thank you. Oh yeah, I don't remember where I found this song, but Ren, I related to Ren on a personal level. I am not as self-destructive as Ren is, but I was that girl from a really boring town in the suburbs that couldn't wait to go to New York City to try to be part of something that had an energy that I thought was interesting or exciting. I decided to try to be a filmmaker, but certainly that idea of feeling out of place where you came from and looking for something that's more interesting. Ren, has no discernible artistic talents, but there were a lot of people around at that time that didn't think that mattered. It was really about sort of promoting yourself, which is not, as time has progressed, is even more prevalent these days. But, there were a lot of people that just wanted to be known. When I look at her and I see her taking those Polaroids of herself, I think of every selfie, she was sort of doing social media, but with a Xerox machine, really. To me, she was very much someone I related to at that time, but when I watched the film again, I can see variations of Ren today. So I'm hoping that she's still relatable to contemporary audiences.
What do you think? Is she? Yeah, I think so. Is John Doe here? John, are you here? No, John Doe's not here. He comes here all the time. He really does. I saw him in the movie, and I forgot he was in it.
Oh. Oh,
He
okay.
actually owns a bar that's right across on Airport,
Oh,
and he'll
okay.
kick you out of that bar if you misbehave. It's like he does in this. Susan, I want to thank you so much for being here, for joining us, for your work, for this film, for your other films, and now that you've come to Austin for the first time, I hope that you'll come back many more times.
I hope so. I hope so.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.